The galactic archivists of Hora had kept records for 11 billion years. They lived on a world made entirely of crystal, where data flowed like water through ancient machines that had been built before most stars were born. Their purpose was simple but important. They watched the universe. They recorded everything, and they predicted which species would live and which would die. The tool they used for this work was called the Cosmic Catastrophe Index. It was the most complete database ever created. Every spacefaring species in the known universe had an entry within its crystalline storage systems. The index knew everything about them. It knew how much heat they could survive. It knew how much cold would kill them. It knew what chemicals they needed to breathe and what foods they needed to eat. Most importantly, it knew their limits. It knew exactly how much pressure, how much disaster, how much suffering a species could take before they simply gave up and let extinction claim them. The index had never been wrong. In 11 billion years of recording and predicting, it had achieved an accuracy rate of 99.97%. When the index said a species would survive, they survived. When the index said they would fall, they fell. The archivists took great pride in this record. They believed they understood the universe completely. Iran was one of the senior archivists. He had served in the great crystal halls for over 3,000 years, watching civilizations rise and crumble across the galaxy. He had 17 sensory fronds that grew from his head like branches of a tree, and each one could detect different types of information. He could taste radiation and smell gravity, and hear the subtle vibrations of data flowing through the crystals around him. He was very good at his job. On the day everything changed, Iran was doing routine work. A monitoring probe had sent back information about a small yellow star in an unremarkable corner of the galaxy. The third planet from this star was experiencing what the index classified as a multiple simultaneous catastrophe event. This was rare but not unheard of. Sometimes the universe simply decided to throw everything at a world at once. Iran reviewed the data with professional detachment. The planet had been hit by three major disasters at the same time. First, a massive volcano had erupted on one of the larger continents. It was not just any eruption, but what scientists called an event. Enough ash and debris had been thrown into the atmosphere to block out most of the sunlight. Temperatures were dropping rapidly across the entire world. Second, an asteroid had struck the northern ocean. It was not large enough to destroy the planet, but the impact had created tsunamis that devastated coastal regions and added even more debris to the already darkened skies. Third, and perhaps worst of all, a magnetar in a nearby star system had released a gamma-ray burst that had swept across the planet. This invisible wave of radiation had stripped away 40% of the world's ozone layer. Without this protection, deadly radiation from the sun would now reach the surface in quantities that most life forms could not survive. Iran entered all this information into the index and requested a survival probability calculation for the planet's dominant species. The index took only moments to respond. It analyzed the species in question, bipedal creatures with 2 arms and 2 legs, standing roughly 2 meters tall at maximum height. They were carbon-based, which was common enough. They breathed a mixture of nitrogen and oxygen. Their skin was soft and fragile, easily damaged by heat, cold, radiation, or physical trauma. Their temperature tolerance was laughably narrow. They could only survive within a range of about 50 degrees, which was nothing compared to most spacefaring species. The index calculated their survival probability at 0.003%. Iran noted this figure without emotion. He had seen it many times before. When a species faced disasters this severe with biological limitations this extreme, they simply did not survive. It was mathematics. It was physics. It was the way the universe worked. He filed the extinction report and moved on to other matters. There were always more worlds to monitor, more species to catalog, more predictions to make. The death of one primitive civilization on one small planet was barely worth remembering. 3 solar cycles passed. Iran had forgotten entirely about the yellow star and its doomed third planet. He was reviewing data from a gas giant's moons when one of his sensory fronds twitched. A notification had arrived. The monitoring probe around that small world had sent an update. Iran opened the file without much interest. He expected to see confirmation of extinction, perhaps some data about how long the remaining populations had lasted before the cold and radiation claimed them. Instead, his 17 sensory fronds went rigid with shock. The species was alive, not just alive but thriving. Iran read the report 3 times, certain there must be an error. The probe showed images of the planet's surface. Yes, it was darker and colder than before. Yes, the radiation levels were still dangerous, but the bipedal creatures had not died. They had adapted. They had built cities underground, digging deep into the earth where the temperature remained stable, and the rock shielded them from radiation. They had developed new crops that could grow in artificial light, modified through careful breeding to filter out the harmful radiation that leaked through their protective structures. They had created filters and shields and barriers using materials that the Index had not even known they possessed. But the most remarkable thing, the detail that made Iran's fronds quiver with disbelief, was what the probe had recorded about their social behavior. When the catastrophes had struck, these creatures had been divided. They had lived in separate tribal groups that fought each other for resources and territory. The Index had predicted that this division would accelerate their extinction, as groups competed for dwindling supplies rather than cooperating. Instead, the opposite had happened. The rival factions had stopped fighting. They had come together, sharing knowledge and resources and labor. They had built atmospheric processors using salvage technology from their primitive space programs, working side by side with former enemies to clean their poisoned air. They had organized massive construction projects that should have been impossible for their level of technology, and they had done it through sheer cooperative effort. Iran immediately requested a full species analysis. The Index processed his request and returned results that were unprecedented in 11 billion years of operation. This species, which called themselves humans, had a survival coefficient that did not behave like any other species in the database. For every other civilization, survival probability decreased as threats increased. This was logical. More danger meant less chance of survival, but humans showed the opposite pattern. Their survival coefficient actually increased when threats became more severe. The worse things got, the more likely they were to survive. Iran checked and rechecked the calculations. He ran the analysis again with different parameters. He compared the results to similar species across the galaxy. Nothing matched. Nothing even came close. Humans were a statistical impossibility, a biological paradox, an error in the fundamental equations that govern the universe. He sent an urgent message to the other senior archivists. Within hours, they had gathered in the Great Hall where the most important records were kept. The crystal walls hummed with data as the archivists reviewed the evidence together. Their combined sensory fronds processed information that would have overwhelmed lesser beings. The conclusion was unanimous. This species required immediate study. The Index itself might need to be recalibrated. For the first time in billions of years, they had encountered something they did not understand. As the archivists made their plans, far away on a healing world, humans continued doing what they had always done. They buried their dead. They told stories about the ones who had sacrificed themselves for others. They made promises to their children that tomorrow would be better. And they kept working, kept building, kept refusing to accept that the universe had decided they should die. They did not know that ancient beings were watching them. They did not know that their survival had broken equations that had stood for 11 billion years. They knew only that they had work to do, and that giving up had never been an option worth considering. The archivists of Hora had no idea what they were about to discover. They had watched countless species face extinction. They had never watched one that simply refused to accept it. 300 years after the first catastrophe, as humans now called it, the observation team from Hora arrived in the solar system. They came in a ship that looked like a shard of living crystal, its surface constantly shifting and reforming as it processed the data it collected. The ship was nearly invisible to human sensors, hidden behind technology that humanity would not understand for another 1,000 years. The team was led by an archivist named. She was younger than Iran, with only 12 sensory fronds instead of 17, but she had a gift for understanding biological species that her older colleagues lacked. She had volunteered for this mission because the human data fascinated her. Every report from the monitoring probes contradicted what she had learned in her training. She needed to see these impossible creatures for herself. What she found when she arrived surprised her immediately. She had expected to see a civilization still recovering from disaster, struggling to rebuild what had been lost. Instead, she found a species that had launched itself into space with desperate enthusiasm. Human vessels were everywhere in the solar system, mining asteroids and establishing colonies on moons and building stations in orbit around every world they could reach. Their technology was crude by galactic standards. Their ships were slow and inefficient, burning chemical fuels that more advanced species had abandoned billions of years ago. But there was something remarkable about the sheer number of them. Humans had spread across their solar system like seeds blown by the wind, landing wherever they could find even the smallest foothold. Established an observation post on one of the moons of the sixth planet. The humans had built a research station there, studying the strange weather patterns in the gas giant's atmosphere. She disguised herself using technology that could reshape her crystalline form into a convincing human appearance and invented a cover story about being a scientist from a minor outer colony. The humans accepted her without much question. They were too busy with their work to investigate very carefully. What observed over the following months, every model the Index had ever created for biological species behavior. The first incident happened when the station's reactor began to fail, detected the malfunction through her hidden sensors before the humans did. She calculated the probable outcomes using Index protocols and determined that the humans would evacuate the station. This was the logical response. The reactor could not be repaired without entering a chamber that was now flooded with lethal radiation. No biological creature with human limitations could survive the exposure long enough to complete the necessary repairs. Instead of evacuating, the humans gathered in the main hall and began discussing options. Watched through the cameras she had secretly placed throughout the station. She saw fear on their faces, yes, but also something else. Determination. Even anger, though the anger seemed directed at the situation rather than at each other. A maintenance engineer named stood up. She was a small woman with short gray hair and wrinkled skin that suggested age. Calculated that she was near the end of her natural. Explained that she had experience with this type of reactor. She knew where the breach was and how to seal it. She could do the job in approximately 15 minutes if nothing went wrong. The radiation exposure from 15 minutes in that chamber would kill her within hours. The Index calculated her survival probability at less than 2%. Everyone in the room knew this, could see it in their faces. They understood what was offering. They understood what it would cost. Suited up and entered the chamber, tracked her progress through the station's internal sensors. The engineer worked with steady hands, moving through the deadly environment as calmly as if she were performing routine maintenance. Her radiation counter climbed steadily, passing safe levels, then dangerous levels, then levels that should have caused immediate collapse. She finished the repair in 12 minutes. When she exited the chamber, her suit was so contaminated that the other engineers had to strip it off her with robotic arms. Her skin was already showing signs of radiation burns. Her vital signs were chaotic and failing. The medical team worked on her for 3 days. They tried treatments that pushed the limits of human medicine. They refused to give up even when every indicator suggested she was already dying. and somehow, against all probability, survived. She would never fully recover. The radiation had damaged her organs in ways that could not be completely healed. But she lived. The other humans celebrated her as a hero. They held a ceremony where they praised her courage and gave her a medal that she could barely lift with her weakened arms. They told stories about what she had done, making sure that everyone on the station and on other stations and on Earth itself knew about the engineer who had walked into death to save her colleagues. Updated her reports to Hora with trembling fronds. The Index had no category for this behavior, had not acted out of biological imperative or survival instinct. She had done something that should have killed her, something that had nearly killed her, to save people she had only known for a few years. It made no mathematical sense. Over the following weeks, observed more impossible events. She watched human pilots navigate asteroid fields using intuition rather than calculation, making decisions faster than their computers could process data. She saw researchers work for days without sleep to complete experiments, pushing their bodies beyond all reasonable limits. She documented social bonds forming between humans within hours of their first meeting, people who would have been strangers becoming as close as family in remarkably short time. The humans shared everything: food, knowledge, labor, grief. When one of them struggled, others stepped in to help without being asked. When one of them succeeded, others celebrated as if the success were their own. They functioned as a collective organism while somehow remaining individuals. The Index had no model for this type of social structure. Then came the incident on Titan. A research team had been studying the methane lakes on the surface of the large moon when a massive storm system developed. The storms on Titan were not like storms on Earth. They could last for months, with winds strong enough to destroy any structure humans could build, and temperatures cold enough to freeze their blood solid in seconds. The team took shelter in their habitat, expecting to wait out the storm for a few days. But the storm did not pass. It grew stronger, feeding on atmospheric conditions that the researchers had not predicted. Their habitat began to fail. First, the outer insulation cracked. Then the power system struggled to maintain temperature. Then the supply drones that should have brought them additional resources were grounded by the impossible winds. Calculated their situation. The storm would last approximately 40 standard days. The team's supplies would run out in 12. Their survival probability was 0.0001%. She filed her report and prepared to document another human extinction event. This would be valuable data. Watching how humans faced inevitable death would help the Index understand the limits of their remarkable resilience. The humans did not die. For 42 days, 23 humans survived in a collapsing habitat on Titan. Monitored them through what remained of their communication systems, watching in growing disbelief as they refused to accept their fate. They rationed their food until each person was surviving on barely enough calories to maintain consciousness. They recycled everything, breaking down waste and damaged equipment to extract every usable molecule. They modified their life support systems in ways that violated safety protocols but somehow kept working. They argued and despaired and cried, and then pulled themselves together and kept going. One researcher, a young man who specialized in atmospheric chemistry, carved messages into the habitat walls, translated them. They said things like, "We will see the sun again, and tomorrow is coming, and we are not done yet." They were not logical statements. They were not based on evidence, but the other humans read them and somehow found strength to continue. Another researcher organized daily gatherings where each person told stories about their lives, their families, their hopes for the future. This seemed like a waste of precious energy too, but she noticed that morale improved after each gathering. The humans drew strength from sharing their experiences, as if the act of speaking and listening generated power that their failing reactors could not provide. A third researcher, a woman named who studied geology, discovered that their waste processing system could be modified to extract additional nutrients from materials they had previously discarded. It was not elegant and it was not pleasant, but it extended their food supply by nearly 2 weeks. When the storm finally passed, 23 humans walked out of that habitat. They were weak and damaged, and some of them would carry scars for the rest of their lives, but they were alive. Intercepted as the survivors were being evacuated to a medical station, she had to understand. She had to know how they had done it. "How did you survive?" she asked. "Every calculation said you should have died." Looked at her with tired eyes. She shrugged, a gesture had learned indicated uncertainty or dismissal. "We're human," said. "This is what we do." Returned to her observation post and spent 17 hours composing her report to Hora. She finally understood what the index had been missing. It measured survival through biological capacity and resource availability. It calculated probability based on what a species could do physically. It had never accounted for spite. It had never measured the human capacity to look at impossible odds and become angry at them. It had never understood that humans did not calculate their chances and make rational decisions about survival. They simply refused to accept any outcome that they did not choose. The index needed to be fundamentally rewritten, and suspected that even then, it would never fully capture what made humans impossible. The Great Hall of the Galactic Council had not been used in 2 billion years. It was a vast space, built into the heart of a neutron star that had been stabilized through technology so ancient that even the archivists did not fully understand it. The walls glowed with the compressed light of 1 trillion captured photons, and gravity itself bent around the chamber to allow beings of wildly different physical requirements to exist in the same space. Representatives from every major civilization in the galaxy had gathered. Silicon beings that thought in crystalline matrices floated beside ammonia-breathing organisms from the outer rim. Energy patterns that existed partially outside normal spacetime flickered next to biological creatures that looked almost like the humans they had come to discuss. The council had not convened for a routine matter in living memory. Whatever was happening, it was unprecedented. Iran stood at the center of the chamber, his 17-sensory fronds extended to their full length. He had spent the last 50 years compiling data about humanity, working with and dozens of other observers who had embedded themselves among the strange species. What he had to present would challenge everything the council believed about the nature of survival. "Distinguished representatives," he began, "I come before you today to request a formal reclassification of the species known as humans. Based on extensive observation and analysis, I recommend they be designated as a Class Omega persistent species." A ripple of reaction passed through the assembled beings. Class Omega was the highest survival classification in the index. It had only been applied twice before in the entire history of the galaxy. The first was a species of machine intelligences that had survived the heat death of their original universe by tunneling into this one. The second was a collective organism that existed across 17 dimensions simultaneously and could not be killed because it experienced time in a non-linear fashion. Both previous Class Omega species had achieved their status through technological or metaphysical transcendence. They had moved beyond the limitations of normal existence. Humans were still biological creatures who died if they got too cold or breathed the wrong air or fell from heights that were barely noticeable by galactic standards. An ancient silicon being named Thrum spoke first. Its voice was like grinding stone, slow and heavy, with the weight of billions of years of existence. "Explain your reasoning, archivist. Humans are fragile creatures with limited and primitive technology. How can they possibly qualify for the same classification as beings who have transcended physical existence?" Iran had prepared for this question. He activated the display systems and filled the chamber with data, showing the council exactly what the observers had documented over 3 centuries of study. The index has been recalibrated 17 times attempting to model human behavior, he said. Each has failed. Humans do not respond to catastrophe the way other species do. The fundamental assumptions we use to predict survival simply do not apply to them. He showed them the statistics. When humans were told that something was impossible, their success rate increased by 340%. When they were protecting other humans, their performance improved by 200% compared to when they were protecting only themselves. They had survived ice ages and plagues and wars and self-inflicted technological disasters that should have ended their existence at least 12 times throughout their history. Each time, they emerged more determined than before. Consider the first catastrophe, Iran said. The index gave them a survival probability of 0.003%. Any other species facing those conditions would have experienced population collapse within one generation. The survivors would have regressed to primitive existence, losing technology and social cohesion as they struggled for individual survival. He showed them what had actually happened. Humans had not collapsed. They had organized. They had shared resources. They had built new technologies specifically designed to address their new challenges. And within 3 centuries, they had gone from near extinction to a thriving spacefaring civilization. Their population today is 7 times what it was before the catastrophe, Iran said. They have established permanent colonies on 37 worlds and outposts on over 200 more. They are developing faster-than-light travel theory that may yield practical results within the next 5 generations. Thrum's crystalline form shifted, a gesture that indicated skepticism. Other species have rebuilt after catastrophe. Resilience alone does not qualify for Class Omega designation. You are correct, Iran said. Resilience alone is not sufficient. What qualifies humans for this designation is the mechanism that drives their resilience. It is something we have never encountered before in any other species. He adjusted the display to show a complex diagram of neural pathways and emotional feedback loops. The council studied it with various forms of attention, trying to understand what they were seeing. Humans possess a cognitive emotional capacity they call hope, Iran explained. This is not the same as optimism, which we have modeled extensively in other species. Optimism is the calculation that positive outcomes are likely. Hope is something different. Hope is the capacity to believe in survival despite evidence. It is the ability to find meaning in struggle itself, regardless of whether that struggle leads to success or failure. He showed them examples. Humans who had fought to save dying loved ones even when all medical indicators showed that death was certain. Humans who had worked to repair environmental damage even when the task would take longer than theirs. Humans who had begun projects that theirs might finish, investing effort in outcomes they would never see. Hope creates a feedback loop, Iran continued. When humans hope, they work harder. When they work harder, they sometimes achieve results that seemed impossible. When they achieve impossible results, their hope grows stronger. This cycle has no theoretical upper limit. The worse the situation becomes, the more hope they generate, and the more hope they generate, the more likely they are to survive. A being of pure energy flickered with interest. But hope is irrational. It ignores evidence and probability. How can irrational behavior lead to improved survival outcomes? Because survival is not always a rational process, said, stepping forward to join Iran. I lived among humans for decades. I watched them face situations where rational calculation said they should surrender. Instead, they became angry. They treated the universe's attempts to kill them as a personal insult. They fought back out of spite, out of stubbornness, out of sheer refusal to give the cosmos the satisfaction of their deaths. She shared her own data, showing the Titan incident in detail. The council watched the records of 23 humans surviving 42 days on supplies meant to last 12. They saw the messages carved into the walls, the story gatherings, the impossible modifications to failing equipment. When I asked the survivors how they had done it, said, they did not give me equations or strategies. They said they had simply refused to die. They said giving up was not an option. They said they owed it to each other to keep trying. Thrum considered this for a long moment. You are describing a form of collective delusion. They believe they can survive because they want to survive, not because survival is actually possible. Yes, Iran agreed. And that delusion makes survival possible. The belief creates the reality. We have documented this pattern thousands of times. Humans who believe they will survive consistently outperform the index's predictions by factors of 10 or more. Their faith in each other and in themselves is not a weakness. It is their greatest strength. He revealed the final piece of evidence, the detail that had convinced him that Class Omega designation was not just appropriate but necessary. Humans actively cultivate hope in each other, he said. They seek out stories of other humans overcoming impossible odds. They teach these stories to their children. Their entire culture is built on the premise that catastrophe is not an ending but a beginning. Every human child grows up knowing about the first catastrophe and how their ancestors survived it. Every human child is taught that giving up is not acceptable. They have created a civilization-wide survival mechanism that transmits itself through stories and examples and shared memory. The display showed human media, human literature, human art, story after story about individuals and groups facing terrible odds and refusing to surrender. Tales of sacrifice and courage and stubborn persistence that humans consumed constantly, reinforcing the patterns that made them so difficult to kill. The index cannot model this, Iran concluded. We can measure biological capacity. We can calculate resource availability. We cannot quantify the power of a species that tells itself stories about never giving up and then believes those stories deeply enough to make them true. The council deliberated for several hours. The discussion was intense, with representatives questioning whether the evidence truly supported such an extreme classification. But in the end, the vote was unanimous. Humanity was reclassified as Class Omega persistent species. A special notation was added to their index entry, a warning for any future observers who might encounter them. When calculating human survival probability, first determine the severity of the threat. Then add the following variable: they will not go quietly. The session ended. The representatives returned to their distant worlds and strange existences. The Great Hall fell silent once more, waiting for the next matter important enough to justify its use. Far away, on 100 worlds scattered across the galaxy, humans continued living their lives. They worked and played and loved and argued and dreamed. They faced challenges large and small and met each one with the same stubborn refusal to accept defeat that had carried them through the first catastrophe and everything that came after. They did not know that ancient beings had spent years studying them. They did not know that their survival had broken equations that had stood for 11 billion years. They did not know that they had been classified as one of the most persistent species in cosmic history. They would not have cared if they had known. There was work to do. There was always work to do. The universe kept throwing challenges at them, and they kept meeting those challenges with hope and spite and an absolute refusal to go gently into any darkness that tried to claim them. Somewhere in the crystal halls of Hora, Iran updated the index one final time. He added a personal note to the human entry, something that would remain in the records for as long as the archivists existed. In 11 billion years, I have watched countless species face extinction. Most accept it with dignity or despair. Humans are the first species I have encountered that treats the end of everything as merely another problem to be solved. I do not know if they will survive forever, but I know that whatever finally ends them will have to work very, very hard to do so. He closed the file and returned to his other duties. The universe was vast and full of species to catalog, But Iran suspected that none of them would ever be quite as interesting as the stubborn creatures from the third planet of an unremarkable yellow star. Humanity had earned its place in the index. Now they would earn whatever came next, one impossible survival at a time.